I'm really honored to be able to host these conversations. My name is Rob Arnold. I'm the executive director of Poets House. And joining me are Chris Hoshnic, Elise Paschen, and Kimberly Blaeser, whose bios are in the packets and on the website. So I will not waste our time since we're running a little late by reading those full bios, but they're amazing artists, community builders, and thought leaders, especially in this area of Indigenous languages and language reclamation and language back. So I think I'll turn it over then to, I think Chris is going to go first, and thank you again for being here. And at some point we'll turn things over to audience questions. So if you have questions in the audience, both online and in the room, please do start thinking about those. And for the folks online, please do maybe chat your question, and then one of us who's monitoring the chat will hopefully signal to us those questions. And again, for those of us who are in the room, please remember that we do have folks online, so do try to speak into the mic, otherwise they won't be able to be heard. So, okay, thanks. Turn these over to Chris.
Can you give me just a hand to it, Chris? Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Which way? Okay. Well, good morning. My name is Chris Hoshnic, and I am a Diné poet. And I think I have a, yeah, okay. So I have a little image, so I'm just waiting for that.
That's up.
Yeah, oh, it's up there? Oh, sweet, okay, there it is. So earlier in my discovery for poetry, I had the opportunity to work with on a translation piece of an Emily Dickinson poem with Beth Pye Tote from UC Berkeley. And I just want to share a piece of that journey with you. Rather than reading it, I'm going to kind of walk through it. What began as a straightforward translation of that famous poem, To Make a Prairie, became something much more layered and a practice in navigating metaphors, language gaps, and environmental worldviews. And at the core of this translation was a question that kept surfacing in discussion. What happens when metaphors don't translate? Or more specifically, when they can't translate directly due to vocabulary gaps or cultural differences. So I chose to focus not just on the translating the words themselves, but on translating the metaphors, particularly what are known as experiential metaphors. And these are metaphors grounded in the bodily and in environmental experiences, like the way we say more is up or rationale is up, both use up, but in the meaning of up shifts based on context. And so this tells us what metaphors are not always one-to-one. And so they can conceptually align even if they don't overlap directly. And so up here, taking Dickinson's original poem, To Make a Prairie, it takes a clover and one bee. The imagery of clover and bees is deeply tied to her pastoral environment, coined by Beth. But in translation this into Navajo, I found that clover and bee don't hold the same metaphorical or ecological resonance in my language or my landscape. So I shifted the metaphor to something that is coherent and meaningful in my culture environment. So clover and bee became corn and wind, right? And so because wind pollinates corn, just like bees with clovers, wind and corn are interdependent elements of my environment, and by extension, my language. And in this metaphor, I was still honoring the truth conditions of the original poem. And the idea is that something substantial in nature is created through the balance of species and elements. But I was doing so through a metaphor that felt true to my surroundings. And now Dickinson adds a fascinating twist where she states, reverie alone will do if bees are few. And here, reverie acts as a kind of a substitute, a poetic or imagined force that fills in for what's missing in nature. And for this, I translated reverie to prayer. And in Navajo culture, prayer is not just spiritual, but deeply ecological. And it's a tool of survival, of balance, of coexistence. So the substitution, while a shift in metaphor, still holds the core meaning. In fact, it makes it more aligned with indigenous cosmologies, and where imagining a better nature or praying for survival are not mutually exclusive, they're intertwined. And so, yes, this does kind of slightly twist the original truth condition from imagining a better nature to praying for survivalhood. But I would argue that with indigenous studies, these are synonymous truths. There are different expressions of the same conceptual balance Dickinson tried to describe. And now the final poem, once rendered in Navajo, readily made sense to those familiar with the language and the landscape. But for monolingual English speakers, especially those unfamiliar with ecological metaphors like corn and wind, might not carry the same conceptual weight. This highlights the an important note. Accessibility in translation is not always symmetrical. So for bilingual speakers, especially those rooted in indigenous languages, the metaphors often flow more natural from English into Navajo than the other way around. And finding equivalents for clover or reverie in Navajo was far more challenging than translating corn and wind into a poetic English. And so this brings me to my final thought I wanted to leave you with in approaching this translation. I asked myself this question from a paper called Experiential Origins of Mental Metaphors. Where do mental metaphors come from? And so for me, they come from land, from experience, from the wind rustling through cornfields, from prayers offered at dawn. Translation then is not a linguistic act, it's ecological, it's cultural and deeply personal. Translation becomes this place of migration, right? And it's a movement across language, across metaphors and worldviews. And as a Dene, I wouldn't say translator, but I carry the task of migrating meaning between two worlds, and where metaphors don't just travel, they start to transform. And this is not about loss or substitution, but about coherence. Coherence meaning bridging between the two cultures and worldviews. But it's about making something live in another place under a different sky. And translation becomes a negotiation between environments and epistemologies, where metaphor is not a barrier, but that, again, like that bridge. And so, yeah, this is, I believe, in Poetry magazine, and everyone can check that out.
Read it.
Can I read it? I'd have to probably turn around. Yeah. Is it over there?
Backwards, though, I guess.
Oh, no, that's not it.
That's not
Oh,
it.
sorry.
No. Okay, so I'll read the English one first and then go to the Navajo. So the original poem is, to make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee, one clover and a bee, and reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few. And so the English translation is, to make a crop, it takes the wind and corn, the corn and the wind and a prayer. The prayer alone will do if the wind is few. And in Navajo, that would be Da'ake. Oh, I'm making it up as I'm going now. Da'ake haloni nilchiko nadan nilchi do sodzen nilchi adengo sodzen beado nil. And so I kind of messed that up a little bit because I was going off of my memory. But that would be the translation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was really enlightening and inspiring. And we had a chance to chat last night with Kim and Chris, and just very wonderful to hear you speak. Thank you. Hawe, Elise Paschen, Jaje Abrié. Hello, my name is Elise Paschen. I'm an enrolled member of the Osage Nation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our relationship with creating a language system for the Osage Nation. So the Osage is one of the few tribes to claim back its own language by developing an entirely new orthography system. The 36-character orthography was developed by Mowgli Lookout and the Osage Nation Language Department staff in 2004. Before this time, we used the English alphabet when we transcribed our language. The Osage Congress officially adopted orthography in 2015. As we say, orthography is sovereignty. I have a personal connection, which is that in 2023, the U.S. Mint issued a quarter featuring my mother, the prima ballerina Maria Tallchief, including her name, Waksay Thunba, and actually to echo back to Chris, which translates as woman of two worlds. And it's represented in Osage orthography. So theoretically, millions of people right now will be holding in their hand quarters with our orthography. I had the privilege of working with the Osage Nation, with the U.S. Mint on the design of the coin. We brought in both the Osage Nation Language Department, and the Balanchine Foundation, because you see my mother in a leap across the stage in Firebird. We also had something else happen in the last couple of years, which is the film Killers of the Flower Moon came out. And again, our Osage language is very present in that film. Osage Nation Language Department worked with the actors, and one of my relatives told me that Robert De Niro's pronunciation was flawless. A line from my poem, and again going back to this notion of prayer, which means prayer in Osage, and the poem's called Wigia, helped to inspire the title for David Grant's book, and then Martin Scorsese's film, Killers of the Flower Moon. So the original line in the poem reads, during Zaga Zika Setha, the killer of the flowers moon. I wrote Wigia in 2006 while researching the Reign of Terror and also delving into our language. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about my new book, which is called Blood Wolf Moon. And it's a deep dive into my Osage ancestry. I've always been fascinated by the Osage language, and I continue to explore the language in this book, in poems in this book. The Osage words in translation conjure the poem for me. I have a bunch of translation poems at the end, and we're going to see a little poem video of one of those poems. The poem is not what I expect to write, but it draws from the past, the dream life, the unconscious, offering sudden surprises. Seeing our language offers glimpses of the linguistic imagination of Osage generations before. So I have a long poem at the beginning of the book called Heritage. It's a crown of poems where the last line of the first poem becomes the first line of the next. And the poem opens, Heritage 1, with the line, once I had a name for everything I possessed, but now I'm silent, afraid to trespass. So I feel that, this becomes a metaphor for my own relationship with the Osage language. The poem circles back, so the final line circles back to the first line. So in Heritage 14, the final line is, now I have a name, Jage Abrié. But for me, it's a constant search, exploration. The epigraph from this book comes from an Osage song, which is, to the door of the house of mystery I have come. So my own learning of the Osage language began with naming. My family and I were given our Osage names. This poem, Two Standards, that I wrote back in the 1990s, was inspired by my mother's name, Two Standards. I wanted to share my poem. We were all asked to share a poem. And my poem has to do with this idea of naming. So, Sorry, lots of notes here.
I have to read some of them in my time.
So the poem I'm going to read is a language origin story, which imagines my mother as a child hearing Osage for the first time. Her father, conditioned by Indian boarding school, spoke only English, even though his mother, Eliza Big Heart Tallchief, conversed in Osage. The poem was originally part of my long sequence heritage, and it splintered off, but it has the same stanzaic structure as heritage. So I think that's enough of a preface. We now have our own Osage Nation language orthography dictionary. So I was able to actually translate my original phonetic spellings into Osage orthography. Wajaje, Osage. The first language, Wajaje, which Eliza, her grandmother, spoke. I try to learn the words, Iye, from a book, a dictionary. What was my mother taught as a young girl sitting on the front stoop of her grandma's house, inhabited by half-brothers she revered? Her favorite hunky, hand outstretched, showed her how to catch the wild horse unbridled in the pasture. She knotted a paisley bandana around her neck. This language for throat, dotse, and tongue, these, words she learns to speak but then forgets. She loosens, waving the rope from the horse's crest. And then we're just going to share, for my little opening presentation, a poem video that was made of one of the poems at the end of the book. And the poem is titled Hoega, or Snare.
Hoega, hohiha, vi brubruhe, ni koha, ni oshotse, non pehit ni omabrin, monkasaki, hoza, obrinke, hoega, wa spe, ja.
Thank you.
Buju Niji, Buju Nindinawe Maganadok. Hello, my friends. Hello, my relatives. Kim Blaeser, Nindigenous, Anishinaabe Kwe, Nindao, Gawa Babi Bonikag, Nindunjaba, Migizi, Nindodem. So I'm Kim Blaeser, and I'm an Anishinaabe from the White Earth Nation of northwestern Minnesota and a Migizi or Eagle Clan. I'm really delighted to be here with you. Am I loud enough? I'll get closer to the microphone. So we had a conversation about what we might do, and we are to share a poem. So I think I'll start that way, but many of the things that Chris and Elise said have already sort of changed what I want to say, because I think we have interesting connections in the work that we do. But I'm going to start first with this little poem that comes from Ancient Light, which is my most recent book. And there's a little tiny piece from the preface in that book, and then there's this longer poem, or it's a short poem, but it's the poem called Songs Like Bread, Wikwandawin. But I feel like they belong together because they are about language journey, I think, and the kind of place that we all in our own ways come from in relationship to our language. As Rob was saying last night, this isn't representative, and no one person is representing indigeneity. But we all have these sort of, I think, cross experiences and cross purposes, and we share certain longings and perhaps certain, I want to say pain, honestly, that what we face is not easy sometimes. And so there's a little bit of that in this poem, but it's also in some ways an invitation. Akawe, a prelude. Between languages, in the shadow of old losses, we adorn ourselves. Everywhere careful words break, open, they feed us. Remembrance like bread. Songs like bread, Wikwandawin. Inhabited, we whisper sort tongue hungers, this blood caress of gone and almost melody. Nuji ikwewe nagamo, courting song, how we yearn for morsels, words, memory tangle of hands kneading bekwejigun. This dollop of sweetest dough, a language prisoner's bread. This is to hunger, bakade. This is to break, bigoshkad. To speak is to eat, Wikwandawin, feast food, our jagged stuttering, a giveaway, muddy o iriwug. This is to share. Miigwech. So I want to connect up with a couple of the things that Elise and Chris have said. And I think that I should say first, my language, my indigenous language is Anishinaabe-Moan, the Ojibwe language. And it is verb-based, and it is relationship-based, so that the prefixes and suffixes of the words are drawing relationships. And it often is a cumulative telling a story, right? So it's about a process in the language itself. I'll say that first. I have a lot more to say, but I wanted to demonstrate that. This is actually interesting to use today because it's French, Anishinaabe-Moan, and English in different parts. But this is a little poem in which I attend to the longest word in Ojibwe language. And the longest word in Ojibwe language is 66 letters. So I thought I'd teach that to you. Minabashki, Minasagani, Batosa Chagani, Badwingwash Chagani, Bekwejigan. Okay? Or shall I break it up? Minabashki,
Minabashki,
Minasagani,
Minasagani,
Batosa Chagani,
Tosa Shagani,
Badwingwash Chagani,
Bagwingash Tagani,
Bekwejigan.
Crazy.
Now I know somebody knows what this means. Blueberry pie.
All right.
So why is that so long? It's so long because it's not just a thing, it's the process of making blueberry pie. And it's the way that sits in the pastoral environment. I just think of the season, or the cycle of seasons, right? So this poem is called To Feast on Story. And it really talks about the images, like Chris was talking about. And there's one image where the berries are lying with their face covered. That's what it says. And that's just, that's what the blueberry pie is. But it's just that I think the languages are doing different things than English. And so that's part of what fascinates me. I guess I should say a couple of things about my own background. So I grew up at White Earth. I'm enrolled at White Earth. My first few years of my life were off the grid with my grandparents. My grandparents were native language speakers. My older aunts and uncles were native language speakers. My mother came at the tail end of 12 children, or second to the last, and she had English as a first language. When we lived with my grandparents, I learned and we spoke both kind of mixed language. And then when school intervened, I think I lost a lot of, so I always say that I have baby Ojibwe. And there's a point at which Anton Troyer, who's an Anishinaabe language teacher and advocate and I don't know, so many things, was at UWM, and I was able to sneak in to sit in on a couple of his classes. And at that point in time, I wrote a poem and I asked this question: how do you conjugate after 40? Because, learning language is different, right? And I always knew, like, a center word around which you build things. So that's why I say baby Ojibwe. And a lot of the other pieces of it were not things we spoke so much in my household when I was young. The other thing is we did code switching. We switched, like back and forth between language in a playful way. We mispronounced English words on purpose as kind of a critique. There's a way that we grew up with language, which I think each of us grew up with language in a different way. So that kind of play with moving between languages is something that I continue in my poetry. And the Ojibwe language was not standardized in spelling until, I want to say, about 20-ish years ago. My great uncle, Selim Ross, was one of the people who worked on the first Ojibwe People's Dictionary, and now there is this beautiful online version with the University of Minnesota, et cetera. But the spelling is now as central as a double vowel system, but that is not necessarily the same when you cross that imaginary border into Canada. So people who speak Anishinaabe-Moan in Canada, they drop fronts and backs of things a lot of times in a way that I don't really know. It's difficult. Language is migratory, and I think it's interesting to think about relationships also in terms of what Chris said, because I grew up in northern Minnesota and spent every weekend of my life except for freeze up and break up on or near the water, doing things that you do, fish and wild rice and set net and skate and all of those things, right? And so the way that I see the world is through the lens of a person from a water reality, right? And so I think frequently now I'm thinking about the way that the languages we know are not all alphabetical, right? We know land languages. We know place and environment languages. Like how many people fish? Okay, so if you fish, you have to be able to read the weeds, the waves, the color of water, what's floating on the water. I mean, all of those things go into understanding your relationship with water and fish, right? That's a language. I think that's a language. And so we have a lot of those other kinds of language, and why do we privilege the alphabetic language over those? That's one of my big questions right now. So I do have more to talk about in that range, but I think that one of the things that I wanted to do is to talk about how Indigenous nations poets has been trying to become a place that supports Indigenous language or language back through poetry. So a couple of years ago, every time I heard the thing about land back, and we would all get so excited whenever some tribe or nation received land back. But inside my head, I kept hearing language back, because I felt like that was another arm of sovereignty and another significant part of, recovery for our culture. And so finally I said it out loud in a board meeting, and Jen Forrester was like, oh my gosh, yes. And so then we went ahead and started the initiative. And what it was at first, actually I'm going to pause here. I just want to acknowledge that Joan Kane was one of the people who first kind of planted a seed, and she doesn't even know this, but we were at IAIA, and she was giving a language workshop, or whatever we called those. And I was just sitting in, and then she called on me to read some Anishinaabe-Moan, and I realized I can't read Anishinaabe-Moan. You know, like I would stumble through a word, and then I'll like, oh yeah, that's what that word is, because I didn't know it as written language. And so that was interesting to me. And there were just many things, but I just thought about, first of all, that was just I was uncomfortable realizing my failure, right? And then I thought about, so many people are afraid to step into language because they're afraid of not being perfect, not getting it right. And one of the first things we do in our Indigenous Nations Poets, which I will get back to, is we try to say, none of this is your fault. You know, it's not your fault that someone stole your language. You know, linguicide was put upon us. It's not something that we voted for, you know. So we decided in Indigenous Nations Poets to think about language back through poetry. And the kind of the thought behind that is that as writers, aren't we all playing with language? And if we're, you know, playing in our Indigenous language, that both reinforces it for us, and it also, like, if there's a morpheme, like Ode in Ojibwe-Moan, which is heart, and Ode appears in drum, and you know it's in strawberry, and all of these different words, then you start to see the relationships and how the language is not flat and not linear, you know, and to me that was really important. And if we encourage poets to just fall into their language in that way and play, there's a little bit of that. There's less tension. There's less, expectation. It's play, and so that helps ease the language journey for writers. But then when we perform or publish, that is giving it back to the community, and so it's that reciprocity, which, if language is a gift to us from our ancestors or from the water or the desert or, the spirits, then it's our responsibility to give it back. And it took me a while to accept my own imperfection. I'm a Virgo, and you have this thing, right, where you want to make sure all your ducks are in a row. And I realized this is who I am and this is what I have now, and that if I accept that, I give other people the freedom to accept wherever they are in their language journey, right? So we did some things at AWP, which was really fun. Hyde, Erdrich, Jake Skeets, Elise and I, and then we brought Esther Bellin and Lucy Tapahanso and Jake on stage, and that was beautiful. And then I wanted to do a pilot project of working in communities. And so we got a little mini grant from Wisconsin Humanities last year, and we went to 2 Indigenous communities. We went to the College of the Menominee Nation, and then we hosted our second one at UW-Milwaukee. And these were day-long events where we invited, so we did 4 language. We had language teachers, and then we had poets, and then we invited community. So at Menominee, we did the Menominee language and Mohican. And at UW-Milwaukee, we did Anishinaabe, and Oneida. And I'm going to show you a film that you can see some of what we did, but the one thing I want to say is we also partnered with the Overpass Light Brigade. And the Overpass Light Brigade was started by one of my colleagues at UWM as a resistance group, organization, activity. And he built these placards with big light bulbs, and those lights would spell out, would be one letter, and then people this is important, people would come together and hold these and spell out words. So the very first thing we ever spelled on the overpass was recall Walker. And the idea, that's why it was called Overpass Light Brigade, because you would stand up there with these lighted placards spelling something, and every person driving underneath would get that message, right? But it expanded, and so we ended up a couple of different times working with Overpass Light Brigade, and I want to give a shout out to Stumptown Media, who was the filmmaker. And so we also did that with the people in our workshops, and we asked the language teachers and the people participating to share language they wanted to spell. And that meant that Lane had to make more vowels for most Indigenous languages, especially in Anishinaabe-Moan. So I can say more about it, or you can ask questions, but let's just run the film.
The favorite word I've ever heard my son say was muthkete. And I've used that word around him. And he used it in the right spot at the right moment. And I think he spilled something off the table or something like that. Muthkete, he just kind of said under his breath. And it's something that should be like discouraged, but he used it properly and he said it in the language, so I thought that was kind of neat.
English, here's the way I explain English. Flat piece of paper, an Anishinaabe-Moan is a cube, it's three-dimensional. I could feel it, I could see it, I could touch it, you know? And it rolls like notes on a bar of music.
So when I first heard it, I thought, wow, the rhythm of the language, it sounds like a song. And then the more I learned, it's like, well, yeah, it's a lot like a song. Certainly with the rhythm of it, but the flow of it, the tempo of it.
We are assimilation's children. We are inheritors of both beauty and heartbreak, of lands and languages, in long-standing relationships, in lands and languages stolen in an effort to destroy our relatedness. Reclaiming our language is this empowering type of movement that we need in our communities to really combat that high level and impact of historical trauma and colonization that we have and face in our communities every single day.
Language is in, everything we do, whether it be going in the woods or wild racing or poetry or whatever. We can do anything and everything in the language.
I'm a big proponent of action, and that sometimes you see movements and it's like, well, is it really moving something? Is it getting you closer to an ultimate goal? So what's the ultimate goal in language revitalization? It's that the next time that you visit my community, everyone in the community is speaking Mohican.
Fire remembers the land, and the land remembers fire. Right, that participating in these sort of processes from an Indigenous perspective is incredibly important. That connects us in ways in which English language just isn't going to get at. This is going to take a long time, and we have to be very, very careful in helping to support one another.
I just feel so connected to this unbroken chain that was very close to being broken. And then I feel so connected to the next 500 years, the next 1,000 years, so we can make sure that we have this language.
I always think about how this shame was instilled on us as a people, not only to be who we were or who we are, but to practice those ways. And it's a foreign concept to be perfect. We're supposed to stumble. Making mistakes is part of life, especially learning to speak your language. Not only that, but removing the shame away from not knowing.
the first and the best thing is to just try. As you continue to learn, you will learn better ways to say things. You will have and create this relationship with the language. And the more time you listen to it and observe it, it starts to become this spirit that you are in connection with.
Nishik namapan kesho awa. Kesho anash pekan mishik. Shakat shakao pita keshik. Kon catch shakatel. Kon catch nakatel. Osham wepat. Kilpona paponoa.
Our language is a spirit. It's a living, breathing entity. And when we invite that into our lives, we start to kind of have this level of awareness that we didn't have before. And what that is really reclamation of our original worldview. Because sometimes our worldview, I think, is quite clouded by colonial thinking and what's normalized as maybe what's not normal for our communities, but what we have taken on over time.
Though we are assimilation's children, we are also the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, the blood relatives of determined and triumphant survivors. Survivors who gave us stories and songs and sacred ways of being. Lucky us to have the privilege to carry those inheritances into our living and into our writing.
In our ceremonial times, when the stories are being told, it's amazing. It's better than being at the movies. All you need is popcorn. There's bikuwadazi. It's the only way I can explain it. The sound of our ancestors. It's beautiful.
Whatever current relationship you have with your own tribal language, I invite you to take the first steps or to take new steps to liberate those trapped voices, to thaw that sea ice of English. I write of tongue hungers and this blood caress of gone. Is there an absence, a hunger, or an ache in your life where language should be? This is a chance for us to take the first steps to take our language back, and we'll be on the journey with you.
Thank you for that, Kim and Elise and Chris. So I want to turn it over to...
Okay, so I just want to say that film is actually in film festivals. So you had a screening and nobody else can see it unless they go to the film festivals, which is, it's happening at some place today Sunday in New York City at the Workers Unite, is that what I said? Workers Unite Film Festival. So it's going to be around. If it comes to where you are, please tell people, send them out.
Yeah, the Workers United Film Festival. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for that. I'm trying to synthesize all the amazing things that all of you said, but one of the things I was really inspired by the concept of translation as a geographic art as well, and I'm thinking about geographies and political geographies, which can sometimes sever our nations and our languages as a result. I don't have a question that lands on that, but I think it's a really powerful and interesting thing. One thing I was thinking a lot about too is the idea of mistake, actually, and imperfection, because as I said, I'm leaning into imperfection in these conversations a little bit, action over perfection, and but the idea of poetry is presented as a kind of perfection. So how do you reconcile those two things, the willingness and the ability to be imperfect in language acquisition and or language presentation, and then also have kind of what would be perceived as a kind of perfection of language through poetry?
Can I start?
Yeah.
So for me, so as we see here, we have three different writers coming to language at different times in our lives. Chris started speaking Navajo when he was born, and you can tell the rest of us. But for me, since I have been learning the language as an adult, though I've been exploring it as a writer probably for the last 30 years, I have been taking Osage language classes for the last year and a half. And for me, I'm wary about performing the language. So I'm very confident and excited when I explore the language on the page as a written medium, but my wariness comes from I want to make sure that I pronounce everything correctly. So that's my relationship.
And I totally relate to that. But I want to tell you a story. So when we had the language back gathering in Menominee, at the end we had a reading, and people could read what they had written that long day, etc. And we were just going around, and we came to someone, and we could tell this person was uncomfortable, and they said, I'll pass. And I saw the language teacher go sit by him. And I think they knew that it was the pronunciation. They were worried about getting it wrong, you know. And we finished the circle as we had in that direction, and then the MC was like, we're just going to go back. Anybody else want to? That young person got up, and they first gave this little impassioned speech about nobody should be ashamed of using their language, you know, and it was this whole beautiful thing. And then they read the poem. And did they make mistakes? Maybe. And do the spirits care? Probably not. You know what I'm saying? Is like, we're trying. I think we're showing up and we're trying. And I think that's what we have to do. I want to tell you this story that my brother tells me about a dream that he had. And he always dreams, he's walking along, and he's walking with Makwa, which is the bear in Anishinaabe. And the bear is talking to him, and he cannot understand. He knows it's important, but he does not know what the bear is saying. And he finally went to one of our elders and asked about this dream, and they said, well, he's speaking Anishinaabe. You have to learn the language. You know, like that's what it was a call to, which is interesting, right?
Yes, I love that.
I'm going to pick this up. I feel like we're doing this.
Yeah, I know.
Well, wait, what was the question again?
I mean, how do you reconcile the imperfections of language acquisition with what might be perceived as a striving toward perfection through the art of poetry, perhaps?
I think the biggest thing that we were talking about last night was it's really easy for a language for translation to become, there's a line between communal and an argument, and a lot of times it flops over into the argument, and then the language doesn't move anymore, right? And it doesn't move into the other space that it needs to move into. But I always saw language as on the page as an adaptation. I never see it as like that's concrete. And I think that's to kind of approach a poem or a piece or even a word. I was looking at Rex Lee Jim's book upstairs, and he said something. He called, I don't remember exactly. I was trying to like sound it out, as Navajo is like sound based, and so the poem was called Ladder. It was the first word or the first poem in the book. And then, but I think it kind of sounded like emergence in Navajo. Like the translation of it was actually emerging. So in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so you use a ladder to emerge or get out of something. And so that, I saw that as adaptation, but I also kind of see too, poetry is not concrete. Poetry is always changing in spaces. And that's why I use videography, or I use typography as a means of accessing that, because I think that typography is is a huge leg up for us in our indigenous languages, because in a lot of I think all of our languages is using Latin-based languages as its orthography origins, and that's kind of scary to think about, because because writing in itself isn't a technology; it's not natural to humans. So that's a weird thing to kind of think that all of these books are they're unnatural to us, and so there's this pressure between us and it, and I feel like typography is my way to kind of say, I'd rather have this have a serif, or this word have a non-serif. So I'm always talking about that, or where it ends up on the screen or the page, and so, but I never see poetry as like this thing that's like consistently, once it's in a book, I don't think that's the final product. I always think that can change in different spaces, different readings, different visuals. In typography, the whole thing could be written in Times New Roman, but I want it in Grammar's, Pro or whatever the font is, and it changes the way it's being experienced. And I want that for every space. So I could present this poem last night in a different font, and it's going to elicit a different experience or a different color. And so that's something I'm always thinking about with language. And but at the end of the day, the poem is it's ever changing.
Yeah, you totally anticipated the trick behind my question, which was the pushing back against perfection and sort of a fixed point. And actually, I'm really glad you brought up typography, because we did poll the issue of Poetry Magazine, and it looks so different on this page than it did up on the screen, that poem, and the impact is so different. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Thank you for that. You also mentioned another thing that I was really thinking about, which is sort of the language of empire and the language of the colonizers' language that we all are speaking in right now. And there's a tension in a lot of these poems, whether you use a Latin-based orthography or you've invented an orthography to capture the language. There is still a tension between the language that we have in common, or the languages we have in common with the languages of our ancestry. So can you talk a little bit about that tension in your poetry and or in your lives, I guess? More, I guess. Some of you have already done that.
I'll just use yours.
Okay, I'll use yours.
Okay, so I love that question. I did want to sort of, maybe I'll touch back to the other question in my answer to that, but first of all, we all strived for something approaching perfection, but that doesn't mean, poetry especially poetry is gesture, and poetry is an invitation for the reader to enter the making of the poem. That's the way I think about it. So in that way, it's not closed, but I also...
And even you perform it different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, for sure, you do. And depending on who's in front of you, right, and the circumstance, right? And sometimes you literally change what is on the page, repeat it, change it, switch it around. But as far as the challenging of the emperors, honestly, I think that a lot of my poems, they do that in other ways too. Like, I am always challenging the idea of measurement, and containment, and the different kinds of words we use to measure things. So I'm interested in that as well, which I try to undermine in the poetry. I wish I could think of a line right now. Oh, it's this. It's one of those little. The way we love something small poems. The last line in is there. Even then, our tenderness too big for accuracy. So it's that the blurring of the way that we hold things. You know, the containers in which we are trying to force them. In different ways, I'm trying to break out of those. But I think that we also undermine the grammar purposefully in our poetry. I think there's a lot of techniques that we use, either subconsciously or consciously, that we are pushing against the language all the time. But I did want to also say, Rob has this beautiful issue of poetry, which is all Dine Poetics, except for me, I'm in there. And as a part of the Ine Po project, we also just did a language back issue with Yellow Medicine Review. So please look for both of those and support those projects.
So I just want to sort of reflect on Rob's question and other comments. I come from a very traditionally based poetry background. So I studied with the Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney. I studied the entire history of prosody with Robert Fitzgerald, who translated the Iliad and the Odyssey. And for me, it's interesting to hear what Chris is saying, because for me, Yeats's notion, and I wrote my doctoral dissertation on William Butler Yeats. And so for me, a poem comes right like a click of a box. So, you know, growing up, I always felt that every line had to be perfect and couldn't be moved. And when I teach my students at the school, the Art Institute of Chicago, I talk about interrogating every word. But I feel that now, you know, with my new book, Blood Wolf Moon, I am now stretching those boundaries, especially with lineation and the page. And I think that coming into closer contact with the Osage language is giving me this freedom to sort of like break out of those boundaries and maybe barriers of a very traditional background in poetry. So, you know, normally if you read all my last 5 books, you could see there's some metrical, numerical, mathematics behind it. But here, you know, I'm just kind of breaking across the page, leaving space, and then these poems at the end, and you caught a little glimpse of just more, you know, going across the page with just space and words and aeration. So I appreciate, again, where this is leading us with our conversation.
You actually completely anticipated my question for you too, Elise, which is the tension between form and language. And I love those columnar poems that we saw. How did you come into that form when you were putting that book together?
It was just very organic, so it just fell into place.
Do you want to describe like the process of, you know, what those poems are doing and
Yeah, but should Chris answer the question first? Yeah. Sorry, let Chris answer the former question.
Sure. Sorry, I'm just going too fast.
Rob. Thank you.
Sorry. Wait, what was the question?
Something empire.
Well, I don't know. I'm always interested in the politics of language, and how in English there's a hierarchy in the sentence structure and the syntax. Mm-hmm. I think it was Bohan Lewis who like eliminated the preposition in all of his writing. And I don't know if that's intentional, but I was hearing him at the I craft talks and readings, and he just talks like that. He says, a rabbit goes and does this, duck does this. It doesn't say the rabbit or the duck or a duck. The prepositions are gone, and he's turning those proper nouns into something else.
The articles?
Yeah. And so it's becoming this like thing, articles, it's becoming this like new way of kind of giving autonomy to the sentence, and I think that's interesting, and he does it a lot in currents. But the thing is, too, he's respecting the form. There was a lot of tercets in that. There was a lot of couplets, and I think that's interesting because it gives it a little bit of structure, which I'm like, I need that. On the page, it needs to be a nice sonnet with a good scheme. You know, the last two lines need to rhyme, but when it's presented or when it's spoken, I glaze over those for a certain reason, and it's just the performance of it matters, and then the presentation of it matters, the typography matters, but whatever's on the page is for the reader in that moment. But as far as the English in and of itself, I think it's interesting to kind of see how the sentence structure sounds are fighting with each other. You know, there's O's that are being neglected in other words that you're using it, and it's just weird. It's odd. And then I was talking to Elise and Kim about this, how English is exhausting. You know, you say one line of a poem, and you're like, and they're reading, right? Or you take a drink of water, but in Navajo, and when you said that long word, you didn't need to take a breath. It was inside the word. And I thought that was really interesting. And how can English serve us in the writing process? You know, and I think of James Baldwin or Fernando Melchor's translator, Sophie Hughes, who translates all of her work. And you kind of see how the breath is in favor of the sentence structure more than anything. And so when you're reading it, you're like, oh, I didn't know I read a sentence that's like 50 pages long. And I think that's interesting. Yeah. Mm.
Thank you. So we have time for an audience question if folks have any questions. And if you are on the Zoom call, a mic could possibly communicate whether we have a question from the audience. But does anybody in this room have a question? Okay. Oh, sorry. Maybe we should. Do you have a mic? Do we have an extra? No, we don't. Okay. We'll share microphones up here.
Thank you very much. Well, I've learned a lot. I'm learning a lot. I just, the word grief just for me permeates. I think about the dream where the bear speaks and the elder says, you have to understand the language of the bear. You have to understand the language of our ancestors. And what I do with that is I just think that we can try to get certain things back, but do we ever? And then I think about one of the lines by a younger poet that I read, the winter keeps ending. And so here you proceed with the spirit and the faith and the hope that very often is human. And yet there's a grief because do we ever get back that winter and that ice and that water, that stream? So I think I'm more filled with the challenge of bringing together language and feel the grief of the ancestor but also the child, because how do you meld vanished worlds, broken up, torn up, ravaged worlds?
Thank you for that question. Does anybody want to try to start? Yeah.
I'm just going to read a stanza. This is a poem I was going to read last night, and I just didn't. I was built by inherited hungers. This is not a poem that names them. As a body politic, we take up space in their ledgers. Yes, my relatives are the salvage bodies of history. We have ways they do not approve of, how we feed ourselves, for one. I have been taught where to find the winter cache of squirrels and how to walk away. As we walk, my brother quiets me. You cannot tell stories until you visit the places they make their homes. Father says the garden song calls the pollinators, and we must sing in tune. Nimama says, leave some for the spirits and the little people. And what she meant was, we are small in the green, frayed body of belonging. We learn from Makwa, from Mahingan, sometimes even from Nunabaju. By this I mean, not everything tattered is ruined.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first stanza of a poem.
Beautiful.
The poetic answer. I don't know if you want a real answer.
Does anybody else want to, or should we leave it at that? That was a beautiful way to end. So thank you. We'll have an opportunity to talk more individually in the next few minutes between our panels. We'll reconvene here at 1 o'clock for our next panel, which is going to be on community and visibility and asserting tribal sovereignty through literature, poetry, and art with Joan Navia-Kane, Bonnie Hartley, and Desiree Bewley Della Giacomo. So I hope you'll come back and in just a few minutes. Thanks so much.